Today we're talking about active stakeholder participation, the third principle of structured decision makings with Paul Gordon, the CEO of Catalyze. Before we get into the conversation today, just briefly, last week we talked about academic rigour, which was mostly about the mathematics around the decision making. So, Paul, can you give us a bit of an overview of what this particular part of the process is?
Sure can, Kylie. I'm probably going to say this every time. This is probably one of my favourite of the principles of structured decision making. I can have four favourites, can't I?
Yes, you can.
Ask me to rate my children. Could never do it. So, in essence, the principle here is that the key word is active. Everyone talks about stakeholders, stakeholder management, stakeholder communication, stakeholder engagement. It's kind of a bit hackneyed, to be honest. And really what we're talking about here is a much more active, proactive, engaging process where stakeholders of the decision, people who are going to be impacted by the decision, actually get the chance to participate in the decision itself. So this is not just let's tell them what's happening or let's tell them what the decision was. It's, well, how could they have a role in actually making the decision here? In fact, one of my perhaps secretly or not so secretly held missions is to create such a decision process that in the future every single citizen of Australia could participate in a decision that the government's making. And I don't mean participate just by voting as we might do in a normal election process, but by actually have an active role. So imagine that, a decision with 25 million stakeholders participating. What could that look like?
Oh my goodness, you've just opened a can of worms. We could just spend the whole time talking about that. So active, you said the distinction here is between active versus stakeholder.
I think the first piece in the world of active stakeholder participation is, well, who are the stakeholders? And then how can they participate? Both in a way that suits the decision, but in a way that suits them as well. And as soon as we open the stakeholder can of worms, you can very quickly get to, well, perhaps the President of the United States is a stakeholder in this decision. If we go far enough, that's perhaps not helpful because the chances of getting him in the room aren't that likely. So there's a job to work out who are the stakeholders. And once we've got a picture of that, then we say, well, how can they participate in a way that adds value to the decision, but also suits them and the way that they want to participate as well. Maybe there's different ways that people can participate that suit their personal circumstances, suit the way that they work, suit the other commitments in their life, that doesn't have them excluded from a decision process just because they don't have the best internet connection in the world, or they don't have the time to spend 4 hours sitting in front of a Zoom meeting.
Okay, so I do want to break this down into a couple of pieces. The first part you said is being able to identify who, and I dare say I've seen people include people because they feel bad or they feel concerned that if I invite that person, that person's going to get upset because they're not invited. Do you find that's the case also with the clients that you work with?
My honest answer is with most clients, it's the opposite problem. It's we definitely don't want that person. We definitely
Really?
don't want that person. Yeah. And in fairness to my clients, it's nothing to do with I don't like them or, they wear terrible clothes. It's more to do with, they're always awkward. They always bring a tricky perspective. How are we going to manage that? Wouldn't it be cleaner and easier if we just had a nice small group of people who all agreed with each other, put them together, and then we'll move on? And I can sympathize with that perspective, particularly when there's a drive in a lot of decision making to get on with things, make decisions quickly and get to the decision. But as we talked about some weeks ago now, the point of decision making, the decision is only part of it. The key part of it really is how you execute and that decision sticks and lives in the world. And one of the key reasons for this whole principle of active stakeholder participation is to try to get us to a place where when a decision's made, everyone sits back and goes, yeah, great decision, let's get on with it, rather than the decision's made, then everyone turns around and says, what a terrible decision, how dare you, you didn't ask me, I didn't have a part in that decision, you've got no idea what I'm thinking, and then start throwing rocks at decisions. So our intention really here is to say, let's get to decisions that everyone's on board with so that they live in the world. And that's, let's just have our nice friendly bunch of people sit around the table. It doesn't lead to that because let's call it the awkward person or the person who might have a contrary opinion, they're not going to disappear. So if you don't include them, the decision gets made, pretty sure they're going to come out of the woodwork at some point. And the last thing you need is your face as a, CEO on the front page of the Fin because some decision was made that didn't allow for that participation.
So I've got a couple of questions. I do want to find out how you go about working out who does get into that active role. But also the thing that I was just curious about was what happens if you've got somebody who you do think should be an active stakeholder, but they're adamant that, they're too busy or they don't have the time, or even that they actually don't even think that they're really the right person to be involved. Like, have you had a scenario like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a common one in some of the big decisions that we're involved in where there's such a range of stakeholders, from small business owners to individual members of the public right up to corporations. And exactly, that is not an uncommon response that says, why me? I've got no time. How can I possibly have a part to play in this decision? And the job there, of course, people like me to design a way that they can participate that suits their needs. And that's where, and to be honest, the whole coronavirus world has caused us to have to think even more creatively as to what that could look like. I'd normally say, well, let's find ways to engage with them one-to-one, conversations, maybe meetings, etc. But even that, some of that's become impossible, especially without travel. So, well, how can we do this in even a paper-based way? And I know this sounds like going back to the future, but actually sending out structured paperwork that they can simply fill in to provide their perspectives in a way that is easy for them to do. They can literally do it at the dining room table if they want to. Frankly, most people can find maybe 30 minutes or whatever to be able to do that. So looking really hard at what actually suits their needs. The other thing, of course, is to not assume what their needs are. So first thing I would always say is ask them how they would choose to participate. In fact, we're doing some really interesting work in oil and gas at the moment, which has that very broad range of stakeholders. And the first thing that the clients are doing is going out to all the potential stakeholders saying, here's what we're doing, here's different ways you can participate, and you choose. And of course, once they choose and they go, oh, I've had a free choice as to what I can do, what suits me is this or this, then we're in much better shape. So ask them is the first thing I'd say, and then be prepared to think very creatively about what that looks like. Don't immediately default to, well, if they can't come to a meeting, then they're not in the room.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that you and I have been doing along this journey is we've been taking it from a different perspective outside of, say, a corporate environment, just to kind of give people a different way of looking at it so they can get a deeper sense of how it applies, right? So let's put it back onto partnerships. In a marriage, for example, there are many decisions that we make about buying certain things, and higher priced items tend to be more things that you make joint decisions about, like purchasing a home or purchasing a car or property, or smaller price point things like whether you're going to buy broccoli or you're going to buy beans at the grocery store are a little bit different. So you could probably assume you don't need to involve your partner. But I want to kind of do that only so that we can really get a very personal view about how this process works. And is there moments, I suppose, in that situation where you really do, as a partner, you go, look, I don't need to be involved. You don't need to involve me in that decision. I really trust you, and I'm pretty sure you're going to make the right decision, and it's okay. You go ahead and do it. And then you go ahead and you do it, and then you buy what you buy. And then they go, why the hell did you buy that? I'm sorry? Excuse me? Didn't you just tell me I should just do all of that by myself, and now what you're telling me is I really made a bad decision?
Yeah, that's a great example. It's a great question. And I suppose how I'd look at that is back to that very first conversation when the partner says, no, over to you, I'm fully on board. What I would be doing is saying, so let's just talk through this process we're going to go through. Okay, so you've said you're fully on board, leave it to me. So what I'm going to go and do is look at some alternatives, understand which one we want to pick, go out and test things out, make the purchase, bring it home, whatever. I'm going to do all of that, and the first you'll know about it is when the thing turns up through the door. I want to check that's what you mean by that. Oh, no, I didn't mean that. No, what I meant actually is come back to me and tell me which one you think we should buy, and then I'll have some opinions about that. Oh, okay, so what you really want to do is what you said was I don't want to participate. What you actually meant was I want to participate at this particular point in the conversation. I'm not interested in looking at all the alternatives, researching, going to the stores, but don't actually get the credit card out until at least we've had a conversation about why we're going that route. And, laughing aside, it's actually quite valid because sometimes you ask someone what they think about a decision. At that moment, they might go, I don't care. When they're suddenly confronted with the actuality of making the investment or facing the idea of driving a pink car for the next 5 years, might actually land a bit differently for them. So this is why when we talk about active stakeholder participation, it looks like many things. Sometimes it is literally just, I agree with you, the process we're going to make the decision. Yep, you and I had the conversation. That's how it happens. That's my participation done. Now I've agreed on that. Away you go. Remembering back to our first principle of process before content, that's a great place. Other times it might be, you do all these things and then come back to me with some alternatives. And I want to see 3 things. Once you've brought 3 things back to me, I'll give you my input and away you go. Or it might simply be, just tell me what you're going to do, but I'm actually going to be the one that signs the check. So many different places that could happen. And like all things in relationship, there's a lot of colour to this and a lot of context to this. That's perhaps not the conversation to have just after something else has happened in the relationship. And I think the modern day enlightened human being is also very aware of their own state of mind at the time of asking the question. If authentically what we are trying to achieve is I don't want them to be involved, I want to get my way, so I'm going to ask them a nice loaded question around, this decision is going to be it takes so much time, and do you really want to be part of that? Am I actually just trying to lead them down a route of not playing, or do I really care about their participation? So we've got to look straight for ourselves as well.
Absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up, because it could be a lot of things from both sides. So 2 things now, how we go about even making the invitation itself and where we're looking from ourselves. But then the other part that I think seems to be important to consider is the impact on our time these days. And I know you've brought this up in previous conversations, that sometimes it's about even working out to slow down the process of getting to a decision, rather than feeling like you've got to rush to make the decision, because people are not getting enough space to do the thinking about, well, what does that really mean when you say that? Because I do think we don't really know, especially since digital disruption in the early 2000s, everything's just gotten a lot quicker, and we're trying to handle more with less. It's getting faster, and the brain's just not coping with that amount of content. Are we even able to really think clearly as it is when somebody immediately asks us those questions?
I think it is a great point, and a phenomenon that we are subject to is a thing called decision fatigue, and this is a well-studied phenomenon. What it means is every time someone asks a question, we have to make a decision, and the more we're facing those minute to minute, the more we get fatigued, to the point at which we may well at the wrong time of day just go, I don't care, just deal with it, don't worry.
Oh, it hits 6 o'clock, what's for dinner? I don't know. Please don't let me have to make another decision. I really do not want to have to even decide on what's for dinner.
It's a thing. This decision fatigue is actually a principle, and especially in a busy household, I would say it's been heightened by people living in isolation and so on, where so much decision making is happening day to day. We haven't had it taken away from us, at least perhaps in a work environment, an office environment. We haven't got to make a decision about what to get for lunch because the cafe downstairs gives us what we asked for. There's a whole bunch of things that have suddenly come into our lives. And what I'd say is our job is to somehow manage that fatigue, find the time to take the breaks from the decision making, and of course reserve our energy for the things that actually matter. The science would tell us we're much less decision fatigued in the morning. So if we've got hard decisions to make about an investment, or we want to have a conversation with our partner about this big decision, that's a better time to do it than last thing at night, just as you're crawling into bed going, okay, well, the day's done, thank goodness. Now, about this new car, what do you think about that's probably not a good time. Unless, of course, what you want, the answer is, I don't care, just deal with it.
It's great. I'm not sure I can structure my day like that, considering what happens in my household, but it's really good. So let's go back, rewind back to that process. Active. How do we make the decisions around who does and doesn't? Do you have much to say about that part?
Yeah, I think, like all these things, the first thing is to kind of look authentically. Exactly like you illustrated earlier, there may well be some people going, oh, do I really have to invite so-and-so to my birthday party? Or how do I decide who not to invite to my birthday party? We've got to be ready to notice whether our decisions on this are being given by some other kind of bias around the way they wear their hair, the kind of clothes they wear, whether they come and drink all my booze. Those kind of questions might be driving in a biased way our choice as to who to involve. So we've got to put that on one side. And probably the way to do that is to think clearly about, when we say stakeholder, what do we actually mean? And particularly in the corporate sense, I tend to kind of bucket stakeholders in 2 broad buckets. I call those stakeholders that participate, I call them of the decision. So what does that mean? That means stakeholders who are impacted by the decision itself, who might not be anything to do with the kind of structural side of the business that makes the decision. They might not be in any of the committees. They might not be in any of the working groups. Perfect example, if a decision might be around a restructure and people losing their jobs, then the people who may lose their jobs are definitely stakeholders of the decision. And perhaps the customers of the company who get impacted by that, they're stakeholders of the decision. So let's get clear on who they are, who's impacted by this decision. Then there's a different set of stakeholders, and there may be some overlap, those are stakeholders in the decision. And they are people who are, your job is to be part of this committee, to make these decisions. Your job is to be part of signing off this process, writing this business case. And they're the ones who, frankly, it's in their role description to somehow have a piece in the decision jigsaw puzzle. Frankly, the stakeholders in the decision, that's relatively straightforward. You kind of know who they are and often written to corporate structures. Although, just on that one point, again, our natural tendency is to want to narrow that group down to reduce the number of people in the room. But frankly, sometimes bring in people from HR, bring in people from finance who might not normally be stakeholders in the kind of decisions that we're making, but having them in the decision process early on, again, will help things stick down the track. But the key people are those stakeholders of the decision. How do we know who gets impacted by this? And best place to start there is literally in a conversation with a few colleagues and a whiteboard and say, well, who actually are we talking about? As I said, if the conversation goes long enough, you soon get to Donald Trump. Might not be the place you want to end up. But you can pretty quickly then start to cross off people who go, well, really, they're impacted in such a minor way. Just to pick my random example, their imagined decision you're making looks like a restructure that might have people losing their jobs. Well, then, of course, their families are definitely stakeholders of the decision because they're going to have some impact from that person who's now out of the workplace. And so you definitely want to think that broadly. You definitely don't just want to go straight to what's the first-hand person that's impacted, I'll consider them. And that's really the way to think about who stakeholders are. When this decision's taken, who actually gets affected by it? And on both sides of the equation, on the upside, which of course could be the shareholders of the company go, great, our share price just went up because we cut a bunch of cost. And then, of course, the staff of the company who may be the ones that are being laid off.
So I'm even thinking applying this, what you're talking about, into the area of startups and small business as well. If you run an organisation where you don't have a team, for example, how far and wide does one want to go? How much research does one want to do? How do you make your decision about really in that situation, we really are the best people? I mean, we talk about areas of expertise, right? Especially in a business, if you just mentioned then, you bring in a HR perspective, you bring in a finance perspective. Sounds like whilst you've got the kind of people perspective about who should be involved, sounds also like there are aspects. What kind of things do you need to know? And are there people with whom could be involved that could be a contribution from certain kind of knowledge base?
Absolutely right. In my corporate consulting speak, I would call them subject matter experts. And let's say it's a restructure. So you may well have subject matter experts in the business of that particular part of the business that you're restructuring. Maybe it's a manufacturing division, maybe it's a marketing division. You definitely want to have involved in the decision those people who are subject matter experts in that field, so that you've got not least, you've got the facts in your fingertips. It's one thing to make an assumption from a bunch of human-centered people to say, oh, yeah, well, that probably won't impact our business too much. But then if you actually bring in the production specialist, they will have a different perspective. So you definitely want to bring in those kind of subject matter experts. Your comment around smaller businesses is a very important one, particularly because, as you say, who might be your immediate team? Well, it might be you or you and your business partner.
Or just the accountant or your husband or your partner.
And I think the trick there is to look more widely. Who could I involve in my decision process? Who might be outside of my business, might be a friend, might be a former colleague, might be a mentor, might be an advisor. People like that can participate well in decision processes. And often people want to more than you might think. So it's always worth asking. The other thing I'd say is always, whoever you think of as a stakeholder, ask them who they think the stakeholders might be as well. So don't sit there with your own list. I've written down my list. That's who the stakeholders are. Actually, once you start engaging with one or two of them, say, well, is there anyone missing? What other perspective are we missing from this room or from this conversation or from this decision process? Which, back to your home example, your partner may well be worth asking them, so who else should we involve? And of course, they may decide to say, well, frankly, you ought to talk to my mother about this. Now, that might not be an attractive proposition, but again, you'll learn something by asking the question, who else do we think the stakeholders are of this decision?
That's really fascinating. I hadn't considered that, but now that you say that, the thing that I'm present to is that we don't really know who else has an influence on that person. Even in an organisation, I think it's the same. If I think about myself, I suppose, in the last role when I was at News Corp, there are certain individuals that I would have coffee with regularly.
Yep.
I didn't report to them, they weren't in my team and they weren't in the division I was in, but I I would use them as just somebody else in the business that I would go to and just either as a consulting conversation or just a catch up, and they'd kind of be a good test for me about the certain decisions that I was making, and I would get their opinion.
This is really this kind of second half of the equation, which is, so what does active participation look like? Because frankly, if you framed it like, so you need to check the decision with my mother, that might not be the kind of participation that would be effective. Whereas if you actually say, well, let's at least have the conversation with your mother about what's important to her in this decision. Let's help her frame up the decision before we do anything to have anything to do with it. Because of course, this active participation can play out in many different places in the decision. It's not just the end point where the decision's about to be made. It's, well, actually, the active involvement of your mother might come much earlier in the whole process, and there's nothing wrong with that. It can be a very positive way of doing it. It's also back to that commentary earlier around asking the stakeholders themselves how they'd like to participate.
Well, I thought I better actually just confess here, none of this is actually in any reality. I don't think I've ever consulted my mother about anything. She'd probably listen to something like this and go, really? That's interesting. Bringing it back into a business context, that the approach that you're saying, I'm hearing you've got three very distinct things in this process about the fact that you've got active. Well, that's very distinct in itself. Then you've got stakeholder. Well, then again, that's very active in itself. And then you've got this final part around participation, and that even has a definition around it. So it's a very considered... You even say structured decision making. I mean, the fact that there's structure just in this process itself. Does it take a long time, I suppose, is what I'm now questioning. In this stage, do you see that there's a lot of time invested in this part?
Like anything, and again, given that I'm a consultant, I can say this, it depends, of course. But the reality is, I guess I would say less time than a lot of people think. In fact, probably the time consideration is one of the things that has people avoid the idea of active stakeholder participation. It's like, the minute we go broadly with our stakeholder participation, we're going to have to consult people, bring them together, wait for their responses. It's going to slow the whole thing down. That's often how people respond, and therefore avoiding that helps them think they're taking time up. I would always say, of course, that one thing is a bit of time invested now could save you a lot of time down track, because if as a result of your decision that didn't stick, the stakeholder group comes out of the woodwork and then starts to relitigate a decision, that can roll on for years. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, there are many different ways this can happen. And okay, let's envisage a nice future again where we can actually put people in a room together to have physical meetings. Yes. Then sometimes literally simply the 2-hour workshop with a key range of stakeholders around the table and having a conversation about a decision process can happen in 2 hours. That's it, done from the beginning to the end. And then you've got everyone on board saying, yeah, we participated, we had our say in how the process should go, we're comfortable with the way the process is going. And as a good point itself, for many stakeholders, just saying, I agree to the process by which you're making this decision, get on with it, don't need anything more to do with it, that's their ownership and engagement right there. So that can actually be a very short conversation. So I would say it doesn't necessarily need to take time. Of course, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, I need a decision by 9:30, doesn't really provide much room for what we're talking about here. But we're generally thinking about things that are a bit more strategic than that kind of conversation. I need the decision if you want milk or not in your coffee. We'll see how many stakeholders have to say about that.
There's another area that I think I'd just, given where we're at in the stage of the journey, we've got one more week talking about intangible and tangible value. Where we want to look at now this week is, one of the things that's come up a lot in this current climate is people reassessing their career, their existing jobs, whether they're in a current job or they've lost their job, and people making decisions about taking a job just because they're going to get a paycheck, which I dare say you got to do whatever you need to do in order to survive during this time, right? And at the same time, there is in the background still doing the work to think about, how am I going to deal with this long term? Sure, in the short term, we're going to deal with a couple of quick decisions in order to get some money in the bank. But let's not forget that actually there's a bigger decision to make around what's the long term going to look like. I have heard people talking about whether they're going to start their own business, for example. So let's just talk about that one specifically, I think, in the process, and applying some of the steps and where we're at. In that scenario, you really are doing the maths. You really are looking at the market and the financial plans and the costs and all the number kind of stuff to weigh up the decision. And then you're weighing up if you've got a salary or you don't have a salary, a whole raft of stuff. Assuming that we've done that. Now we're at the point called, well, we haven't made the decision, right?
Yep.
But we're now looking at active stakeholder participation. So now what we're doing is looking at what are you going to now look at this week in regards to your consideration when it comes to this decision about whether you start a business, you go out on your own. What are some of the things we want them to start to take a look at in this stage?
So the first question I would ask in the current context of active stakeholder participation, of course, who are the stakeholders? And much like the rest of the conversation we've had today, probably wider than you might think. So it's one thing to go, it's my call, I get to say, that's that. Well, you might say your other work colleagues, if you're in a current role looking to step out into your own, they could well be stakeholders, either because, of course, they're the ones left behind when you disappear, or they might have something to contribute to your new business. They might be customers, they might have a network that they could give you access to. So there's a group there. Of course, your family, because who knows what other circumstances are going on, whether you have other people working at home, etc. I remember when I first set up my business, the first stakeholder for me was my wife. It was like, okay, I actually need her on board to effectively be prepared to bankroll this business. Does that work for her? Okay, and then I looked at what went broadly beyond that, and it then became her family because of their concerns for her. It became my family. And in fact, in my case, my family were helpful because they said, well, maybe I'll provide a bit of financial support and assistance. And that might not have occurred to me until I thought of them as a stakeholder in the decision. So I'd say, firstly, sit down, work out who are those stakeholders. Again, resist this temptation to go, and it's understandable. Perhaps one of the attractions for your own business is finally I get to be my own boss. I get to say how it goes. Everyone else can just do whatever they do. I'm in charge. Great. And so given that as often a driver for many people into their own business, it's very tempting to then go, I'm not going to talk to anyone. I'm going to just get on and do this. And definitely kudos for people who take that approach. But the reality is, down track, those stakeholders are going to somehow come out the woodwork. Either they're going to be the customers you want, they're going to be maybe the investors that you need, they're going to be maybe the business partners you want. So I'd say think about who those stakeholders are, and then let's start to think of different ways you can involve them in that decision process. Be clear on what the decision is you're going to be taking and how they can participate.
That's fantastic. Okay, well, the key takeaway for today is to take a good look at that. What are the big decisions that you are facing? Take a considered approach to thinking about the stakeholders, and as Paul said, think broadly, don't just think of the obvious ones. Then look at the decision process you've got and see how you think those stakeholders could play an active part. Look at potentially talking to a couple of those people and asking them about how they see they could participate. And look, I guess the motto out of this period has been we are in this together, and collaboration and partnerships is a huge opportunity for people during this time. And at the same time, as you say, Paul, it's not an automatic thing for us to consider, especially if you feel like you're not sure about certain things and too afraid to ask. Now, before we do just close off on that, Paul, is there anything else that you think that we need to cover or talk or just add in for people about this week's principle?
I think, actually, the one thing I would just like to say, one of the key points here is around diversity. In fact, this world we're living in today, on the one hand, diversity is the buzzword. Yeah, great, we should have diversity. And on the other hand, a lot of the structural situations, especially in corporate Australia, do not provide for diversity at all. And here, really, we are talking about diversity of stakeholders. How do you really look, and where can I find different opinion from? How can I find someone that is not just going to look like me, smell like me, taste like me, and think like me? Because no question, all the evidence suggests that diversity improves decision making, and here's a great opportunity to find diversity and bring them into your decision process.
Really great point to add on. So thanks again. Okay, we'll enjoy that task. We look forward to having you back again next week, where we're talking about the intangible and tangible values, which is the final principle of structured decision making. Have a great week, and make sure you reach out to some of those people to see that you can get a really good, what we call in the corporate world, a good stakeholder map. Thanks, Paul. We'll see you next week.